Hi there, everyone. My name is Amanda Horowitz, and I'm here with my right-hand woman, Laura Hetzler. And we are here to talk to you about building your school list. We have taken this workshop and divided it into 3 parts so that students who are working through the process of deciding which schools they should be applying to can approach this process in 3 sections. This is part 1.
In this section, we're going to talk about the introduction to this process. We are going to demystify the Apply Everywhere strategy, and we're going to break down the reasons behind why we recommend following a more targeted path. And that includes things like financial considerations, the time and effort you have to devote to this project. And then at the end of today, we'll give you some tips for getting the list making process started.
So let's talk a little bit about an overview of all of the things that you want to consider as you are beginning to decide on what schools to include in the list that you want to apply to. One of those things is finances, and we're going to do a deeper dive into that today, but the application process is a very expensive one. And so considering the cost of primary application and all of the costs that follow is really important in making these decisions. Next thing that we'll touch on is time and effort. And then parts 2 and 3 will dive into the competitiveness discussion, really breaking that down into where numbers come in and where your fit for the schools that you're looking at comes in. And we'll also touch on all the other things that you may want to research and consider as you're really narrowing down that list.
All right. So when we talk to students, students tend to fall into one of, I think, either 2 buckets. Either they're just, they have one school that really matters to them. Maybe they're really into Wayne State or really into University of Michigan. But more likely, they will say things like, I'm just going to apply anywhere I think I could get in. Anywhere that I'm a good fit. Anywhere that is a match for me. And it gives the impression it's almost like throwing darts at a dartboard, right? It's throwing everything out there and seeing what sticks. And we can understand that, right? Because this is a competitive process. You want to increase your odds, and it seems like just increasing the number of schools you apply to is going to increase your odds. But there's a catch-22 to this Apply Everywhere strategy.
And that is others. You should only cast a net wide enough for the number of fish you can hold, meaning you should only be applying to the schools that you can really afford to, that you have the time and energy to see the application process all the way through for, and that you really are competitive at by doing a deeper dive into what your numbers are, which means having both a verified GPA and an MCAT score. And then the fit thing, right? Like Laura said, we hear a lot of students who will say, I want to apply anywhere I'm a good fit, but doing the research to find out where you are a good fit, right? And not just assuming that because you like the colors blue and gold, you're a good fit at the University of Michigan.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to start a deeper conversation on financial considerations. One, by the time you get ready to apply, you already have some sunk costs, right? You've already spent money on maybe a graduate school exam like the MCAT or the DAT. You've spent money on, taking these classes that you need, maybe adding in an extra class or 2 for a specific school. So you've already invested some money in this process. I think it's really, really important to understand how much future money you're going to have to spend as you go through the application cycle. Each application portal has a primary application fee. What that means is it will cover the application cost of processing and applying to a single school. And then each additional school you apply to will typically have a secondary or supplemental fee. This may be due at the time of submitting your primary application. If you're applying to DO, PA, dental schools, those fees are typically in under the supplemental material section. And if you're applying to MD, Those fees will usually be assessed later when you're issued an invitation to complete a secondary application. Schools are going to ask for deposits if they do offer you a seat. It is not uncommon for students to have to put down multiple non-refundable deposits, again, depending on the program you're applying to. And that's another sunk cost that it can be highly expensive. It can go up to, $1,000 to hold a seat at a particular school. So you need to be prepared for that piece of the expense. If you have the opportunity to do a campus visit, that can be another place you're going to have to spend money. Campus visits would usually happen after an acceptance was offered. And then it's an opportunity for students to get to know the school they're interested in a little bit better firsthand. Most but not all interviews continue to be virtual. So a campus visit can be your only opportunity as a potential student to learn a little bit more about what that school is like on the ground. And then finally, and I think this is the piece that people anticipate the most, is the expense of tuition that you'll be encountering over the next 2 to 4 years.
So just to emphasize kind of some of those financial considerations that Laura just talked us through, we have broken out the various centralized application service fees for each of the application services that we're really talking about today. So as you can see, the initial fee for each of the MCAS, the AACOMAS, the dental school application ADSAS, and the PA school application CASPA is a large chunk of money. And then each additional school that you add will be a dollar amount, right? So if you end up applying to, 10 schools, it's going to be $175 plus 45 times 9. Terrible at math, so I'm not going to do that, right? So you can do a quick calculation, but this only covers the primary application fee. As Laura just reviewed, after that primary application fee is submitted, each school will request some kind of supplemental or secondary application fee, often somewhere either close after the primary is submitted or later on when secondaries are being submitted. We do want to recognize that each of the application services does offer fee waivers for those who are eligible for it, but there's a lot of variety or it's not variety, a lot of variation in what those fee waivers cover, depending on the application service. Some of them are very much awarded on a first come, first served basis after eligibility is determined. So it's very, very important if you plan on using one of these that you submit, pretty early on in the process to have the best chance of getting it. We want you to, recognize that fee waivers are available, but if you do qualify for a fee waiver, still take into account all of the other things that we're talking about here so that you're using that fee waiver to its advantage, right? Making sure that you're using it to apply for AMCAS to make sure that the 20 programs you're adding are the best 20 programs that you can apply to.
Okay. Another thing that costs in this process is it costs you time and effort. It's important to recognize and understand the amount of writing you're going to do after you submit your initial primary, okay? You, on the MD side, will receive secondaries. On the other CAS systems, we've been working with students to submit to a program first so that they can get their primary application verified, and then adding, as you add additional schools, you will have additional fields open up in the supplemental materials section. And this is where those secondaries will probably be found for dental, DO, PA programs. There's a ton of writing you're going to have to do. We see anywhere from 3 to 9 short essays around the country that will help schools identify whether or not the candidates match them in terms of the goals of their program. You will need to devote a lot of time to this. And you want to make sure that you have that time on your calendar, so it's important to consider, are there other family commitments? Are there family weddings? Are there holidays? Are there vacations planned that are going to impact the amount of time you have available to spend on this? We want you to turn those secondaries, those program materials over within 2 weeks. So you really need to consider whether or not that's realistic for you if you apply to 40 schools. We also want you to think about how to maximize the effort you're putting into each individual program. You'll hear about pre-writing, especially if you're on Reddit or something. You'll probably hear students talking about pre-writing, and it is a strategy that students often use. It's not always beneficial, and that's because schools can change their questions from year to year. So if you go on to Reddit right now and you're asking, what were the University of Detroit Mercy's essay questions last year, they may or may not be the same this year. What we do recommend is identifying themes and spending some time thinking about themes that you may see and ways that connects with your own work and activity and life experiences, and maybe jotting down some notes. If you want to learn more about this process, we recommend you look for the STAR interview technique, which aligns with our suggested strategy for pre-writing. It's important to think about how you are going to be able to spend your effort so that each application you submit is well done. You don't want to rush this process, risk reusing an essay and including a wrong school name, or submitting an essay that doesn't really answer the question because you haven't taken the time to rewrite it and make sure that it is achieving the goals that will get you that interview seat. Next slide.
The other thing I'll point out about this is sometimes the students will travel for a considerable amount of time overseas, and internet access becomes a huge issue, right? So they have all of the time to do the writing, but then having reliable internet access to submit those secondary prompts or essay question answers becomes an issue. So also something to consider.
Thanks.
All right, so getting started, where do you start, right? Considering geography, right? Regional or national geography, and residency is a great place to start, okay? Michigan residents, so if you're a resident in Michigan, are going to be more competitive at out-of-state private institutions because of the way funding works, right? Public schools are funded by taxpayer dollars. And so when you look at applicant numbers and acceptance numbers, you'll see a predominant number of those out-of-state public institution classes coming from the state that they're in, right? And we'll talk a little bit about where to find that data later on in another part of this series, right? If you are an international student, it's really important for you to check whether or not a professional school accepts international applicants. There are a considerable amount of schools that will not in each professional area. So make sure that you're not wasting an application just because you didn't check that piece of information. The same is true with DACA students, right? When you are starting this process and begin by considering these factors to create kind of like your big list and then narrow, you're at least choosing schools that you know are making sense in terms of your residency and like what the data tells us about likeliness of being interviewed and accepted. Yes, there we go.
Okay, so to wrap it up, the short list of things we want you to know after watching this video is that it's really important to make a strategic list. It's because it's expensive, it's stressful, but ultimately, just applying everywhere doesn't get you what you want. So after you've made your giant list of the places that you're really eligible to apply, we're going to dive into 2 more videos. In part 2, we're going to talk about assessing your numbers. So what are your numbers? How do you look at data to make sense of your numbers? And then we're going to talk about, in the 3rd video, assessing your fit. So how do you look at the information that schools provide on their websites, in their print materials, in their social media, to help you understand whether or not you really fit the profile that that particular program is looking for. Thanks so much for joining us today, and we look to see you again in the future in part 2, assessing your numbers.